I arrived exactly on time because that's who I've always been. The man who honors a clock. The man who shows up, even when he knows the room might not want him. My black shoes were freshly polished, a subtle shine catching the city's last flickers of dusk as I stepped out of the car. The collar of my shirt was stiff, white, almost too formal, but I figured if I was going to be a ghost at my own family's table, I might as well be a well-dressed one. I could already feel that quiet ache beginning to throb again, low in my chest, part anticipation, part dread, like something pressing its fingers slowly into my ribs. A family dinner, they said. Just us. Just to reconnect. Those were the words Harper used when she called. My daughter. Her voice had cracked slightly when she said it. That crack was enough to get me here. The restaurant was beautiful. Maison Verite, French for House of Truth, though I doubted there'd be much honesty at that table. Glass walls. Chandeliers that looked like frozen rain mid-fall. Waiters in sharp black and white. Everyone around me looked like they'd stepped out of magazines, glossy and untouchable. I walked through the entrance with my shoulders square, nodding politely at the hostess who barely lifted her eyes before murmuring, "Private dining room, last door on the left." They were already seated when I walked in. I stood for a moment in the doorway, just long enough to see the spread, 2 bottles of wine, appetizers half-eaten, laughter like shallow water bouncing off the walls. Clarice was seated in the middle, as radiant as ever in a dark green silk dress that shimmered under the dim lights. Her hair had that perfect bounce to it, not a strand out of place. Wallace, her new husband, was at her side, his arm resting too casually across the back of her chair, like he owned not just her, but the air she breathed. Reese, my youngest son, had his head bent over his phone. Logan, the oldest, was already halfway through a steak, chewing with his jaw clenched like even dinner was a competition. And Harper, my Harper, lifted her head when she saw me. Her smile was late. Too late. "Dad," she said, rising halfway as if unsure whether to hug me or wave me off. I nodded. "Harper." I looked at the table, then again. 6 seats. 6 people seated. I made 7. I stood there a moment longer, still holding my coat over my arm, the cold from outside not yet leaving my skin. My eyes swept the table again, waiting, just waiting, for someone to notice. To shift a chair, grab one from the wall, make a space for me. That's all it would have taken. But no one moved. Reese didn't even look up. Clarice reached for her wine glass. Logan wiped his mouth and suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. Wallace was the one who spoke. "Maybe a cheaper place would have been better for someone like you," he said, lifting his glass lazily, his smile tight and deliberate. My eyes met his, and I laughed. Not because it was funny, not because anything about this was amusing. It was the laugh of a man who'd been pushed, ignored, and rewritten out of his own story for too many years to count. A man who had been quietly underestimated for far too long. The laugh didn't echo. It landed like a stone in water, soft but deep. I slowly walked around the table, each step a quiet refusal to shrink. I leaned on the back of Logan's chair, felt the leather give slightly beneath my grip. Still no one moved. I looked toward Harper, searching her face for a flicker of guilt, some signal that this wasn't what she'd planned. But all I got was a weak smile and a shrug. "I guess we didn't think through the reservation," she offered, eyes downcast. "Didn't think through. I'd raised these children. Paid for braces, college tuitions, late-night mistakes, and early morning rescues. I was there for every flu, every scraped knee, every whispered prayer during thunder. And yet somehow, they didn't think through whether I'd need a chair." I stepped back, put on my coat with the same careful deliberation I had used to polish my shoes earlier. The ache in my chest wasn't quiet now. It was screaming, but I refused to let it bend me. I straightened, gave a short nod to no one in particular, and turned to walk away. That should have been the end of it. The story of the old man who was forgotten, who didn't fit anymore in the very family he'd built. But I stopped. My hand was on the door when Wallace's voice followed me like oil on water. "Some folks just don't belong in places like this," he said. It was a whisper, but meant to be heard. I turned, slowly. Belong. That word twisted something inside me. I looked around the room one last time, not at them, but at everything else. The paintings on the wall, the floors, the gold inlays, the wine, the fabric on the chairs. The silverware they hadn't even noticed was engraved with initials. They thought I didn't belong. And that's when I remembered who I was. Not just a father. Not just a man in old shoes. but Garrett Monroe. And they had no idea what I'd built in the silence of their absence. My name is Garrett Monroe, 72 years old, but some mornings I feel all the decades stacked on my back, like rusted bricks welded to my spine. I was a husband for 28 years. Not perfect, not always graceful, but present. A father to 3 children, Logan, Reese, and Harper, each one with a piece of my heart they never had to earn, just hold. I used to think being a good man meant giving up the things you wanted so others could have what they needed. I didn't chase promotions because Clarice wanted to go back to school. I skipped vacations because Logan needed braces and Reese had a knack for breaking things we couldn't afford to fix. I sold my guitar, the one I swore I'd never part with, so Harper could attend dance camp one summer. That was the deal I made with the universe. Take what's mine and give them more. Love, in my mind, was measured in what you were willing to lose quietly. When Clarice left me, she didn't scream or throw plates. There was no scandal, no affair I could point to and call betrayal. No long, tearful confession, just a folded note in an empty closet. You're too old, too simple, too slow for the life I want, she'd written. Not cruel, just cold, like stating the weather. She took the house, the good dishes, the savings. The court gave her full support because she asked for it with a smile and a few carefully rehearsed tears. The kids stayed with her. Logan was already out of college by then, Reese still finishing up. Harper had just turned 21. They didn't fight it. They didn't question it. They said, Mom just needs a fresh start. I said nothing, because I still believed, foolishly, that love and sacrifice meant something. That once the shock wore off, they'd come back. They'd remember the man who taught them how to tie their shoes and wipe their noses and fill out college applications. I believed silence was strength. But that night at the restaurant, standing there with my coat still draped over one arm and no seat waiting for me, I felt every bit of that silence implode inside me. The way Logan avoided my eyes, like he couldn't stomach the sight of me. The way Clarice didn't even flinch when Wallace made his little joke, like she hadn't once told me I was the most decent man she'd ever known. Wallace. He wore confidence like a tailor-made suit, tight and smug. The way he tilted his wine glass toward me when he mocked me like I was a charity case that kept showing up uninvited to his new kingdom. And Harper. My sweet Harper, who once fell asleep on my chest every night for 3 straight summers, pretending we were a raft and the living room was the sea. She gave me a smile too weak to hold weight, like maybe she regretted calling me at all. And still, I said nothing. I left that room without causing a scene, without throwing my voice across the polished floors or flipping the table that had no place for me. Because I've spent a lifetime being the man who absorbs rather than explodes. The man who lowers his voice instead of raising his fists. But I remember everything. Every birthday they forgot. Every holiday where my name was an afterthought on the group text. Every whispered moment when I convinced myself not to be angry because I didn't want to be the kind of father who demanded love out of guilt. I remember sitting in my tiny one-bedroom apartment 3 years ago, eating a microwave dinner while they posted photos from Clarice's birthday brunch. Me cropped out of every memory. I remember Logan asking for money to get back on his feet after his second startup failed. I gave it without hesitation. Never saw a dime again. I remember Reese using my old truck for a few weeks and returning it with a cracked windshield and a full ashtray. He never said thank you. I remember Harper calling me crying because she didn't have rent and needed a place to stay. I gave her my bed and slept on the couch for 6 months. I remember Clarice sitting across from me during mediation, listing off every chore I failed to do during our marriage like it was a courtroom indictment. She didn't mention the birthdays I never missed. The way I drive 2 hours to her mother's house every Sunday without complaint. The time I worked double shifts for 3 months so she could open her little boutique. No, those things don't make it into official records, but they live in me. Every kindness uncounted. Every sacrifice unspoken. I remember each one. And that's why the moment Wallace sneered and Clarice looked away, something inside me shifted. Not rage, not bitterness, but a kind of clean clarity, sharp and still. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't looking for their love. I wasn't standing there hoping to be seen. I was just a man who had walked through fire and realized he'd stopped feeling the heat. There was no chair for me, but that didn't mean I didn't belong. It meant they didn't know where they were sitting. They didn't know who they were sitting with. Because the man they thought I was, the forgotten one, the aging relic in worn shoes and silence, they buried him too soon. And now, as I left that room, I wasn't walking away wounded. I was walking towards something I had been building all along in the shadows of their absence. It was Harper who called me. The last voice I expected, if I'm being honest. It came on a Thursday, early afternoon, while I was fixing the railing on the back porch of my apartment. The phone buzzed in my shirt pocket, and I nearly let the drill slip when I saw her name. I stared at it for a beat too long. We hadn't spoken in months, outside of the occasional one-line text or bank transfer request. I pressed answer, careful not to sound surprised. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady but cautious. "Dad," she replied, her voice light but distant, like someone speaking across a frozen lake. "We're having a dinner. Just the family. It'd mean a lot if you came. Just the family." The words sounded like an echo from another life. I said yes, because that's what I do. I say yes, even when I shouldn't. Even when everything in me screams to pause and ask the question, why now? The restaurant, Maison Verite, wasn't the kind of place I'd ever pick. Too polished, too self-aware. But I arrived on time, like I always do. That's something I never stopped doing, even when the rest of the world seemed to forget it mattered. There was a flicker of hope in me, if I'm being truthful. Maybe things were turning. Maybe this was a step forward. A reconnection. That's what Harper had said. When I reached the private dining room, the sight struck me like a quiet blow. They were already seated, Harper, Logan, Reese. Clarice sat in the center like a queen overseeing her court, wrapped in an emerald gown that shimmered each time she lifted her wine glass. She looked younger than I remembered, thinner too, like time had chosen to erase only her burdens and none of mine. And then there was Wallace. I'd seen photos of him, of course. News articles. Corporate spotlights. Always smiling, always surrounded by people who laughed just a beat too early, trying to keep up with the tempo of his arrogance. In person, he was worse. He wore his wealth the way a man wears authority, overcompensating in every polished surface. Gold watch, navy suit, white teeth. The kind of man who walks into a room and assumes it belongs to him before checking the deed. He leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, glass of wine poised perfectly in one hand as he turned to see me standing there. I scanned the table, 6 chairs, 6 people. I was the 7th. My mouth opened slightly, not to accuse, not to protest, but to ask the obvious. And yet, I stopped myself. I wanted to see who would notice, who would move, who would speak. No one did. Harper gave me a quick wave. "Dad, over here." There was no chair next to her. She didn't look down at the floor, didn't glance toward the wall to see if an extra chair could be brought over. Just smiled and waited for me to sort myself out. Logan sipped from his glass and mumbled something to Reese. Clarice crossed her legs and tilted her head, not even pretending to be surprised. Maybe this wasn't an accident at all. Maybe this had been the plan from the beginning. Still, I stepped forward, trying to keep my smile steady. "Looks like I'm the odd one out." That's when Wallace spoke. "Maybe a cheaper place would have been better for someone like you." He said it like he was ordering a drink. Calm, confident, knowing it would land. His lips curved into a smirk, the kind that lets you know he said things like this before and never been corrected. The others didn't laugh, but they didn't speak either. That silence, their silence, cut deeper than the words. I laughed, not because I found it funny, but because I needed to keep the anger from rising up and spilling all over the floor like broken wine. It was the laugh of a man who had been dismissed one too many times. A man who had learned how to turn humiliation into composure. A man who knew exactly what was happening and exactly how to remember it. Reese finally looked up. "Maybe we can just squeeze in," he said weakly, glancing around. "There's no extra chair," Clarice added flatly, her eyes never leaving her plate. "We told the restaurant 6 guests." Told the restaurant 6. Harper frowned, as if she were just now doing the math. "Oh, right." I stood there, coat still in my hands, feeling the cold of the evening creep back into my bones. I nodded slowly, the kind of nod that says, "I see you all clearly now." I looked at each of them, letting the silence stretch. Then I gave them a smile, calm and clean. "No problem," I said, turning on my heel before anyone could mumble a half-hearted sorry. But I didn't head for the door. I didn't rush back to the street to disappear like an afterthought. I walked to the front of the restaurant, back through the corridor of gold accents and marble flooring, my footsteps unhurried. The maitre d' looked up as I approached. "Is everything all right, sir?" I smiled. "I need to speak to Maurice. Tell him Garrett Monroe is here." He blinked. "One moment." A minute later, Maurice Delacroix appeared, trim, gray-bearded, dressed in his usual navy three-piece suit. His face broke into a grin when he saw me. "Garrett, it's been too long." I extended my hand. "Your partner needs a table." "Of course," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Your usual spot?" As I followed him, I could feel the burn of eyes turning from the private room. The silence that had followed me out was still following me in a different way now. Because the table I was walking toward? It had always been mine. They just didn't know it. I didn't rush. That's the part one remember most. I didn't storm through the restaurant like a man-slided. I walked with intention, the way you do when you've outgrown needing permission to exist. Past couples clinking glasses. Past white-coated waiters gliding between tables like shadows. Past a live jazz trio in the corner playing something slow and smoky. Every step I took echoed against the marble floor like punctuation. I had nothing to prove, but everything to show. The hostess caught my approach and blinked like she'd just remembered she should have known me. She straightened her shoulders. "Can I help you, sir?" I smiled. "Yes. Please let Maurice know Garrett Monroe is here." She nodded quickly, picked up the phone behind the podium, and whispered into the receiver like she'd just been handed a VIP situation, and she had. Less than a minute later, he appeared. Maurice Delacroix, owner of Maison Verite, co-founder, visionary, according to Chicago Magazine. My friend. His face split into a grin the moment he saw me. "Garrett," he said, his arms wide, voice booming with the joy of a man who doesn't fake hellos. I stepped forward and gripped his hand firmly. "Maurice, it's good to see you. You should have told me you were coming," he said, giving my shoulder a warm pat. "We would have had your table ready." "I'm going to need it now," I said with a small smile. "The family forgot to save me a seat." His brow furrowed. "What? Who would—" He stopped himself, then caught something in my eyes. "Ah, understood." He turned, already gesturing to the head waiter nearby. "Mr. Monroe's usual, please. Right by the terrace." "Right away," the waiter said, rushing to prepare it. Maurice placed a hand on my back and began to lead me through the restaurant, through a different corridor, to the elevated section just off the terrace, my table. The one I had picked 18 years ago when we first opened this place. The one we had agreed would always be mine if I ever needed it. I'd never used that right. Not until tonight. As we passed the private dining room where my ex-wife and children sat, I felt the air shift. Heads turned. Forks paused. I didn't look directly at them at first, but I could feel it. The confusion, the sudden unraveling. Their laughter had stopped. The hum of smug comfort was gone. I knew they were watching. I wanted them to. When Maurice pulled out the chair for me, I thanked him and took my seat slowly, laying my coat across the back like a man who planned to stay a while. A menu was placed in front of me, though I didn't need it. Maurice already knew what I liked. I let my fingers rest lightly on the linen-covered table, looking out over the soft lights of the terrace. This was a good view. A private view. It felt earned. Then, I turned toward them. Wallace looked like he had just swallowed glass. His smirk was gone, replaced by a frozen, puzzled half-smile, like his brain was still trying to catch up. Clarice stared, her wine glass still halfway to her lips. Logan looked between me and Maurice like he was trying to solve a riddle he didn't know he was part of. Harper's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. "And Reese?" He finally stopped scrolling through his phone. Maurice gave me a glance. "Do you want me to speak to them?" "No," I said calmly. "This is a family dinner, after all." I stood slowly, placing both hands on the table behind me as I looked toward them, my voice low but clear. "You're right, Wallace," I said, watching his eyes narrow. "This place is expensive. That's why I bought 49% of it 18 years ago." Silence. Not the kind that fades in. The kind that crashes, like a wave breaking on stone. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the waitstaff slowed, caught in the moment like leaves in a frozen breeze. Clarice's lips parted, but no sound came out. She blinked, once, twice, like someone seeing an old painting they forgot they'd sold. Wallace managed to swallow. "You, what?" I walked a little closer to the edge of their table, keeping my posture casual, not gloating, just standing in the truth. "Maurice and I started this place from the bones of an old shoe store," I said. "While you were out buying yachts with someone else's money, I was scraping walls and signing quiet deals. I put in capital, sweat, and silence, because I knew my name didn't need to be on the front to have a seat at the table." Logan looked genuinely stunned. Wait, you never told us. No, I said. I didn't. Why? Harper asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I met her eyes. Because people show you who they really are when they think you have nothing. Wallace chuckled bitterly, trying to recover. So what? You sat on a restaurant investment all this time? You waited just to, what? Embarrass us. No, I said evenly. I waited because I thought maybe, just maybe, one day, someone would remember who I was before I had to remind them. But tonight made it clear you weren't going to. So I did. Maurice stood quietly behind me, hands clasped in front of him, his loyalty unspoken but solid as bedrock. This wasn't a moment of vengeance. It was clarity. Clarice finally found her voice. You bought into this place while you were living in that tiny apartment? Yes, I said. Because I was investing in what mattered. Dignity. Legacy. And because I knew that money without meaning doesn't last. I let you have the house, the support, the narrative, but I never gave you my worth. You just stopped looking for it. They didn't know how to respond. That was the most telling part. They sat there, wealthy in appearance and bankrupt in awareness. I stepped back toward my table, lifting my glass as the waiter poured a rich red blend. I didn't toast. I didn't need to. I simply took a sip and nodded, not at them, but to myself. This was the taste of silence reclaimed. This was what it meant to stop waiting to be seated and simply claim your own place. Because tonight, I wasn't just a guest. I was the owner. What none of them knew was that I'd been preparing for this moment for years. Not with bitterness. Not with rage. With patience. Quiet, deliberate patience. The kind you only learn when life strips you of everything you thought made you whole. After the divorce, when Clarice walked away with the house, the car, and the public sympathy, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment above a barbershop. It smelled like talcum powder and aftershave, and the floors creaked like they remembered better days. I didn't complain. I didn't fight her in court. I could have. I had grounds. But I let her have the things she thought mattered, because I knew something she didn't. Things break. People forget. Appearances fade. But foundation? That's forever. I worked part-time fixing things around the neighborhood. Gutters, leaky sinks, busted screen doors. Menial stuff, the kind of work no one boasts about. But I liked using my hands. I liked the feel of solving something physical, something small that stayed solved. And while I patched roofs and rewired ceiling fans, I listened. I watched. I learned. The world likes to talk around quiet men. I let them. Because people reveal themselves when they think you have nothing to offer. They assume your silence is submission, not strategy. They mistake simplicity for stupidity. And they show you, day after day, what they think you're worth. Clarice never asked what I did with my time. The kids never asked what I did with my money. Because they assumed I had neither. That worked to my advantage. I kept my name off the surface. I operated in trust agreements, silent partnerships, side ventures no one knew I had a hand in. I started with real estate. Old properties with good bones, the kind that scared off flashy investors because they didn't shine yet. I flipped them slowly. I reinvested. Then I bought into a laundromat that ran 24 hours a day and never missed a profit. I bought into a car wash that cleaned more than just sedans. City contracts made sure of that. And then, years ago, I partnered with Maurice on Maison Verite. Back then, it wasn't the crown jewel it is now. It was a crumbling shell of a space with potential buried beneath dust and cracked tile. Maurice had the vision, the culinary skill. I had the capital and the patience. We struck a deal. He'd run the front. I'd stay in the back. 49% ownership, silent. No press. No public title. Just results. And over time, results came. Maison Verite became the place in Chicago. Politicians, celebrities, business moguls. Everyone wanted a reservation. The waiting list stretched for months. Articles were written. Accolades stacked up. Maurice got the spotlight, and I got the satisfaction. Not just of return on investment, but of building something no one could take from me. And still, I let them believe the version of me they had created. Broke. Tired. Forgettable. I let them see the worn shoes, the quiet apartment, the handyman gigs, and think that was all I was. I didn't correct them when they looked through me at family events. I didn't speak up when Wallace joked about my retirement life, or when Logan asked if I needed help with groceries once, as if I were a stray he pitted. I let them pile assumptions like bricks until they built a wall between us. Because when people think you're beneath them, they become their most honest selves. Every cold birthday message, every skipped invitation, every moment they left me out and thought nothing of it, I cataloged it. Not to hold a grudge, but to understand. To accept. Because the man they believed I was had never been real. He was their projection, a cautionary tale they could pity and forget. But I wasn't that man. I was the architect of my own reinvention. I had used their absence as space to rebuild myself without interruption. Reese once joked that I still wore the same jacket from his high school graduation. He was right. I did. But not because I couldn't afford a new one. Because I didn't need one to prove anything. Because that jacket had seen more growth than any of them had in years. Because it still fit. And maybe I wore it to remind myself that identity isn't found in threads. It's in choices. Harper cried on the phone once, late at night, when she was facing eviction. She didn't call Clarice. She didn't call Wallace. She called me. I didn't know who else to turn to, she said. I sent the money without a word. She thanked me, then disappeared again for 6 months. I didn't chase her. I didn't mention it when we finally spoke again, because I wasn't collecting debts. I was collecting truths, and truth always surfaces. Eventually, Logan wanted a loan for his 3rd business attempt. Just a small bridge loan, he called it. He wore a suit when he visited me, like it would impress me or justify the ask. I said yes, then watched him lose it all in under a year. No repayment, no apology, just silence. The kind that told me he never expected consequences because he never imagined I had options. Clarice remarried a man who wore money like armor. I'd seen Wallace in articles, standing behind podiums and beside politicians. But I knew what arrogance covered emptiness. And I knew Clarice hadn't married love. She'd married leverage. When she looked at Wallace, she didn't see partnership. She saw positioning. I knew that because she used to look at me the same way before I stopped climbing ladders she no longer valued. So I watched, and I waited, not for revenge, but for readiness. And when Harper invited me to that dinner, when I saw that empty space where my chair should have been, it didn't surprise me. It confirmed what I'd already known. They weren't just careless. They were willfully blind. And that night, when I stood before them and told Wallace I owned part of the restaurant he thought he'd mocked me in, that was not a reveal. It was a reminder. A reminder that the man they thought they had left behind had never stopped moving forward. That while they traded empathy for status, I was building something real. That every time they overlooked me, they were giving me freedom. Freedom to act, to build, to reclaim. Because the most dangerous kind of man is not the one who speaks loudly. It's the one who listens, waits, learns, and remembers. I didn't need to embarrass them. That was never the goal. But silence, real silence, the kind that swallows a man whole, has to end somewhere. And that night, when they left me standing without a chair, something inside me clicked into place. Not a plan, exactly. The plan had already been set in motion years before. But a decision. A moment when the dam finally cracked, and I realized it wasn't pride keeping me quiet anymore. It was fear. Fear that I'd lose them if I told the truth. But I had already lost them. So I chose to speak, not in anger, but with precision. Maurice and I met the next morning over coffee at his townhouse. He offered me a bourbon. I declined. I want to invite some friends from the press, I told him. Not a media circus. Just a few people with good pens and long memories. He raised a brow. You're ready, then? I am, I said. It's time they see the whole story. Not just the part where the old man gets forgotten at dinner. Maurice didn't ask for details. He knew me. Knew how long I'd been collecting the quiet cuts and storing them like drywood. All I needed now was a spark. The invitations went out subtly. A wine-tasting night. An investor profile. Maurice framed it as a story about legacy, about the foundation of Maison Verite. No lies, just enough bait to get them curious. A few names from Chicago Magazine, a woman from the Tribune who loved underdog stories, a podcaster with a cult following who specialized in stories you almost missed. I didn't write a speech. I didn't prepare a statement. I didn't have to. I just waited. The following Thursday evening, they arrived. Not in hordes. Just enough to fill the edges of the room, cameras tucked into shoulder bags, notepads resting on laps, recorders nestled beside half-finished glasses of Merlot. I sat at my table on the terrace, calm as ever, sipping slowly. The staff was briefed. Maurice was steady. And I watched. From the moment the first flash went off, Wallace began to sweat. It was subtle at first, the loosening of his tie, the darting glances toward the cameras, the visible calculation behind every movement. Clarice leaned in to whisper something, but the way her mouth tightened made it clear she didn't like the answer. Logan tried to pretend nothing was happening, but his hand kept reaching for his water glass like it was going to save him. Reese looked annoyed, like the cameras were ruining his night. Only Harper looked genuinely confused. "Why are they here?" she mouthed toward me. I gave her a small shrug and smiled. Let her sit in the question. One of the reporters made her way toward my table. She was older, in her 50s maybe, with eyes that had seen 1,000 stories and still knew how to spot the ones that mattered. "Mr. Monroe?" "Yes. Would you mind if I asked a few questions?" "I'd be honored," I said. She sat across from me and clicked on her recorder. "We've heard whispers that you're more than just a silent partner here." I nodded. 49%. Since the beginning. "And that the people who invited you here tonight, they didn't know?" "No," I said. "They didn't. Why now? Why let them find out like this?" I looked over at the table where my family sat. They weren't eating anymore. They weren't talking. Just watching. Listening. "Because I needed them to understand," I said. "Not what I own. Not what I've built. But what it costs to be invisible to people you raised." That line landed. She blinked, then nodded, quietly scribbling it down. Another reporter joined. Then another. Before long, they were all there. Gathered around the man who had no chair but owned the floor beneath their feet. I didn't grandstand. I didn't name names. I told the truth. About how I invested while they looked away. About how I rebuilt quietly, without applause. About how legacy isn't something you boast. It's something you live, every day, even when no one's watching. Wallace tried to interrupt once. He stood, waved a hand, chuckled like the whole thing was a misunderstanding. "Let's not turn a family dinner into a press conference, folks," he said, his voice straining at the edges. "We're all just enjoying a meal." The Tribune reporter turned to him. "Are you the son?" Wallace blinked. "I'm the husband." "To the ex-wife?" "Yes." The room tilted. The silence grew teeth. "And you didn't know he was a co-owner?" she asked, incredulous. He forced a laugh. "Of course not. Garrett's always been humble." "No," I corrected gently. "I've always been quiet." "That's not the same thing." Clarice didn't speak. She kept her eyes on me the whole time, her face unreadable. But I could feel the unraveling behind her eyes, the slow erosion of her certainty. She thought I'd vanished. Thought I'd gone soft and tired in some dusty corner of the world, nursing regrets. She never imagined I'd turn that silence into something sharper than memory. The podcaster asked for a title. Something to frame the story. I gave her a half-smile. "Call it whatever you want. But the truth is, they kicked me out of a restaurant I helped build." The next morning, that was the headline. He bought the restaurant they kicked him out of. It was everywhere. Online, in print, trending by noon. The story took on a life of its own. Think pieces, tweets, reaction videos. People loved the irony, loved the reversal. But what I loved was quieter. It was the phone calls that didn't come. The texts that went unsent. The sudden, startled respect in people's eyes when I walked into rooms. I didn't bask in it. I didn't strut. But I did watch. I watched the way Wallace stopped talking in public for a few days. I watched how Clarice stayed off social media. I watched Logan walk into a business meeting 3 days later and find himself being asked if he was the one from that story. And I knew then, they'd finally seen me. Not as the father they tolerated. Not as the ex-husband they pitted. But as the man I'd always been. The kind who builds in silence and speaks only when it matters. They asked for a meeting. Not in so many words, of course. Clarice called first. She never said sorry. Just cleared her throat and asked, "Do you have a moment to talk?" Wallace followed with an email, short, formal, filled with the kind of language cowards use when they're trying to keep their dignity intact. Logan texted, simply, "Can we meet?" No press. That one almost made me laugh. I agreed. But not at the restaurant. I chose my downtown office, the one none of them knew existed. 13th floor, skyline view, no name on the door. Just a black plaque with the word Monroe etched in silver. I told them to come at noon. I told them not to bring lawyers. I didn't make threats. I didn't have to. They were already off balance. They arrived like strangers to their own story. Wallace in a suit too sharp for sincerity. Clarice in a coat I'd bought her years ago. How poetic. Logan wore tension like cologne. Reese trailed behind, hands in his pockets like a child dragged into a parent-teacher conference. Harper was the only one who looked me in the eyes when they entered. She didn't smile, just nodded. A flicker of something I couldn't yet name passed between us. But this wasn't about sentiment. I didn't sit. I stood behind my desk, tall and silent as they filed in and took their seats across from me. The room was sleek. Dark wood, soft lighting, a wall of glass that framed the Chicago skyline like a painting. It was designed to make people feel small. I didn't build it for that purpose, but I wasn't above using it now. I'm not here for apologies, I began. Don't waste my time with guilt you don't feel. We're past that. Wallace shifted uncomfortably. Clarice pursed her lips, then glanced toward Logan, as if hoping he might step in. He didn't. I'm here, I continued, to offer you 4 choices. You may pick one. Decline them all, and I go public. Completely. I have journals, voice recordings, receipts. Every birthday I've funded, every tuition payment, every deposit, every text message asking for help while I was supposedly forgotten. And believe me, the media will be interested in the next chapter of that story. The silence that followed was clean, crisp. I let it sit. Option 1, I said, ticking it off with my fingers. You record a video together. All of you. Public. Sincere. You explain what happened. You acknowledge how I was treated. No spin. No manipulation. Just truth. Clarice's brows rose. You want a confession? I want accountability, I said. She nodded slowly, but didn't speak again. Option 2. You repay me every cent I gave over the last 20 years, college, weddings, down payments, bailing out poor decisions. That total, with interest, is $980,000. I have the figures. I'm happy to share. Logan blanched. Reese coughed into his fist. Wallace leaned forward, clearly ready to argue, but I held up a hand. I'm not finished. He slouched back, jaw tight. Option 3. You work for me. In my businesses. Entry level. No titles. No perks. Minimum wage. You clock in. You clock out. You learn from the bottom what you never bothered to ask me about. You're joking, Reese muttered. I'm not, I replied. He leaned back, scoffing. You want us to scrub floors? I want you to earn your names back, I said. I let that hang before moving on. Option 4. You perform voluntary community service. Documented. Not a weekend of charity golf. Real work. Elder care facilities. Food banks. Neighborhood clinics. You serve the people you forgot existed while you chase status. Wallace finally couldn't contain himself. This is extortion. No, I said. This is a mirror. And if we refuse? Clarice asked, her voice brittle. I stepped around the desk and stood in front of them. Then I release everything. The story doesn't end with the restaurant. It continues. The former wife who took everything and left a man for dead, only to discover he'd built an empire beneath her nose. The children who turned their father into a footnote, only to find out they were living off the very man they abandoned. You'll be famous. Not the way you hoped, but famous nonetheless. Harper looked down. Logan ran a hand through his hair. Reese mumbled something I didn't bother catching. They sat in it. The weight of it. The undeniable reality that they had misjudged not only my worth, but my silence. That they had dismissed a man who had built more in the shadows than they had under spotlights. I'm not asking you to grovel, I said. I'm giving you a chance to realign. You want to be part of my life again? Prove it. You want redemption? Earn it. Clarice crossed her arms. You've been planning this. I nodded. Not to punish you. To prepare. Because I always knew the day would come when you'd either face me honestly or fade from my story entirely. I made space for both. Wallace stood up. We need time. You have 48 hours, I said. And I don't mean, let me get back to you. I mean a firm commitment. Pick a path. Then walk it. Or walk away. They filed out one by one. No one spoke. No one dared. As the door closed behind them, I finally sat down, folding my hands in my lap. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. That's the thing they never understood about me. I don't move fast. I don't shout. I don't swing wildly. I plant. I water. I wait. And then, when the time is right, I harvest. 40 hours later, I got the call. They agreed. They had to. Watching Wallace scrub red wine out of crystal stemware was one of life's smaller mercies, quiet, ironic, and deeply satisfying. He wore a white apron over his $1,000 shirt, sleeves rolled up awkwardly, beads of sweat forming on his hairline even in the walk-in's cool air. No cameras this time. No spotlights. Just the rhythmic motion of a man cleaning what he once thought beneath him. The first time I saw him drop a glass, his hands trembling just slightly, I didn't laugh. I just looked at him and said, "Try not to chip the stem. That's a $120 glass." He didn't speak, just nodded and kept scrubbing. Logan was stationed a few blocks away, managing the parking garage that fed into one of my real estate holdings. 40 hours a week in a booth, logging license plates, handling customer complaints, tracking shifts. His first week, he showed up in a tailored blazer and slacks, still believing that appearance could substitute for grit. By week 2, he wore jeans and a company fleece, head low, attitude even lower. But something in him began to shift. The way he talked to the overnight crew changed. He started staying after his shift to help the morning guy tally cash reports. He wasn't smiling yet, but he wasn't scowling either. Reese did landscaping in winter, which meant mostly snow removal and clearing dead brush and frozen air. He'd been furious when he first saw his assignment, calling it manual punishment. I reminded him that everything he'd built so far had been funded by someone else's hands, namely mine. Time to learn what they feel like, I told him. His first day, he slipped on black ice and bruised his hip. Didn't call in sick the next. There was a kind of humility in that. A beginning. And Harper. Harper worked in the kitchen at Maison Verite. Not in front of the house. Not greeting guests or hovering near the wine list. No, she was in the back, peeling vegetables, prepping sauces, washing dishes when needed. I had spoken with the head chef personally. "Don't go easy on her," I said. "Treat her like anyone else." He did. On her third day, she overcooked a reduction and got chewed out in front of a dozen staff. She didn't cry. She didn't call me. She showed up the next morning 15 minutes early and asked to redo the sauce. That was the first time I allowed myself to feel something beyond detachment. Clarice didn't show up anywhere. She stayed away, which was predictable. The moment her control dissolved, so did her presence. She wasn't built for accountability. She had always been the kind of woman who made an exit before she had to offer an explanation. But I kept a distant eye on her through a quiet network. People talk, especially when someone's reputation takes a hit. Word was getting around that her husband was working back of house in his own city, her sons were going through something, and that the story of the forgotten father who owned the restaurant was still circling in the media. She didn't respond to any of it. Didn't defend them. Didn't defend herself. That silence was a confession all its own. Social media, of course, took the story and ran. I didn't post anything myself. I never had. But the reporters had captured enough. The image of me walking past their table at Maison Verite, hand on Morris's shoulder, was reposted hundreds of thousands of times. Podcasts debated whether I was a hero, a genius, or just a bitter man who played the long game. Some called it revenge. Some called it redemption. But the ones who understood said what mattered most. He did it with dignity. I did a few interviews. Selected ones. Nothing flashy. I turned down the TV specials, the talk show appearances. I wasn't a spectacle. I was a statement. One man's quiet proof that you don't need to scream to be heard. That you don't have to throw a punch to deliver impact. People started sending letters, emails, messages, from all over. Fathers, mothers, children who'd lost contact, grandparents raising grandkids. "You gave me hope," they wrote. "You reminded me it's not too late." I read every word. I responded to most. Not because I needed their praise, but because they understood. They knew what it felt like to give everything and be thanked with silence. One letter stuck with me. A man in Detroit, 64, said his daughter hadn't spoken to him in 8 years. Sent me a photo of a letter he planned to mail her. "You made me believe she might still read it," he wrote. I stared at that line for a long time. Because, in the end, that's what it was all about. Not the press, not the money, not the dramatic reversal. It was about belief. That maybe love isn't always loud. That maybe good men don't finish last. They just finish differently. There were moments, during those weeks, when I'd walk through the kitchen and catch Harper sneaking glances. Not with shame. Not with fear. Just curiosity. She was starting to see me again. Not the man she'd built in her head, but the man who'd stood behind her all her life, even when she didn't notice. Once, during a lull between dinner rushes, I caught her sitting on a crate by the back prep area. Fingers stained from beets, face flushed from the oven heat. I leaned against the doorframe. She looked up. "I didn't know you could do all this," she said, voice small. I nodded. "That's because you never asked." She swallowed. "I'm asking now." And that was enough. I didn't do any of it for attention. I didn't orchestrate their downfall so I could stand over the ruins. I just wanted the truth to speak. And when it did, the fire didn't just burn them. It warmed me. Because for the first time in years, I didn't feel erased. I felt seen. Months passed, and somewhere along the way, the fire faded into something gentler. It didn't smolder with resentment anymore. It warmed. It illuminated. The headlines slowed. The online noise quieted. People moved on, as they always do. But for me, the story wasn't over. Not because I wanted more revenge or recognition. Because something unexpected had begun, something I never asked for, never expected to receive again from them. Growth. It was Logan I noticed first. He still worked at the garage, but his posture had changed. Less stiff, less performative. He stopped barking orders at the overnight team and started bringing them coffee at the beginning of their shifts. I watched him from the booth window one evening as he knelt beside a busted ticket machine, sleeves rolled up, trying to fix it himself instead of calling someone to do it for him. That mattered. That told me something had landed. Later that week, he knocked on my office door downtown. Not to argue, not to explain, just to sit. I didn't realize, he said after a long silence, how much of you I never saw. I didn't answer right away. I waited. Let him find the weight in his own words. I used to think you were just stuck, he continued. Like you didn't try hard enough. But I look back now and see, everything I had, everything I was ever proud of, came from you making it possible in the background. I looked at him and said, it wasn't your fault you didn't see it. It's just, I stopped showing you. He nodded, eyes rimmed with regret. But I'm trying now. And he was. That was the thing. He was showing up early. He was teaching new hires how to handle dispute calls. He was even running mock training sessions on weekends. There was no audience, no applause, just the quiet work of rebuilding something broken. Reese was a slower burn. He'd always been reactive, loud when he was hurt, louder when he was wrong. But something about the cold changed him. That winter job, clearing ice off church steps, digging out snow from elderly folks' driveways, laying mulch when the thaw came. It stripped the bravado off him. He started coming home tired. And I mean honestly tired, not the tired of a man who complains for attention. One evening, he showed up at my door with blistered hands and asked if I had any of that balm I used to keep under the sink. He didn't have to say anything more. I went to the bathroom, got the tin, handed it to him. He rubbed it in silently, then said, I never even thought about how hard you worked when we were growing up. I just assumed that's what dads did. It is, I said. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't say thank you. He nodded. Thank you. Harper came around most often. She'd knock before entering, always with something in her hands, leftover brioche from the kitchen, a book she thought I might like. Once even a photo of us from when she was 5, framed and cleaned like she'd been holding it for years and only now remembered its worth. We didn't talk about the restaurant much. We didn't talk about Wallace. Mostly, we sat in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than before. It didn't hurt. It rested. One morning, she came in early, before even the staff, holding 2 coffees. She handed one to me without a word, pulled out a stool, and sat. I went back to reviewing the inventory sheets, but I could feel her watching me. Dad, she said softly after a while. I looked up. I miss you. 3 words. So simple, and yet they carved something open in me I hadn't realized was still shut. It wasn't I miss what you did for me. It wasn't I miss the money. It was I miss you. I set the papers down. I'm still here, I said. She blinked back something, nodded. I know. I just didn't see you for a long time. And now, she smiled. Now I see everything. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No hug, no tears, just a stillness between us that felt like peace. The kind that comes not when wounds are erased, but when they're finally acknowledged. Clarice, true to form, remained silent. I didn't expect a letter. I didn't expect her to walk through my door one day with apologies or excuses. That wasn't her. She'd built a life on control, and now that she didn't hold the reins, she didn't know how to move. But I didn't need anything from her anymore. That was the difference. I had stopped waiting for her validation long ago. The seat at my table she refused to offer back then. I no longer needed to fill it. Not with her. The remarkable thing was that, without even trying, my children had started filling it instead. It wasn't perfect. Logan still had his pride. Reese still flinched when corrected. Harper still carried guilt like a second skin. But they were trying, not because I demanded it, but because something in them had finally begun to shift. They were learning to carry the weight of their own reflection and not turn away. That, to me, was enough. One night, after closing, I walked into the kitchen to find Harper sitting on a flour sack, exhausted but smiling. She looked up at me and said, "You know what the difference is now?" "What's that?" "We're not just your kids anymore. We're becoming your people." And she was right. This wasn't about punishment anymore. This wasn't about forcing them to see my worth. This was about transformation. The kind that takes root when the noise fades. The kind that grows in the absence of ego. And slowly, steadily, I watched it happen. Not with fireworks. With quiet acts of presence. A year later, we had dinner again. No press. No spectacle. No performance. Just us, my children and I, at a small round table tucked into the corner of Maison Verite, the same restaurant where everything had once unraveled. The same restaurant where I had stood without a chair while they feasted and forgot. But tonight, nothing felt the same. The table was already set when I arrived. Intimate, candlelit, no extra eyes, no Wallace, no Clarice, no tension pressing against the glass like a storm waiting to be let in. The first thing I noticed wasn't the setting, but the chair. The one they had once forgotten. It was there now, waiting for me. And not just any chair, my chair. The leather one Maurice had specially commissioned years ago. The one that had always been reserved for me when I visited quietly in the background. Tonight, it stood at the head of the table. And it was the first one placed. Harper was already seated, thumbing through the wine list but not really reading it. Logan stood when I approached, something respectful in the gesture, something that used to come from me and was now finally finding its way back. Reese looked up from his water, gave me a short nod, and scooted over slightly to give me more room, even though the table was already centered. Small things. But they added up. "Dad," Harper said, rising to greet me. She leaned in for a hug. Real. Unforced. I returned it without hesitation. Her hair still smelled faintly of rosemary and flower. Her hands were rougher now. That told me everything I needed to know. "You're early," Logan said, smiling faintly as he pulled out my chair. "I built a life showing up on time," I replied, settling into the seat. No point changing that now. The waiter came by, greeted us all by name. This time, not just mine. Reese had apparently started showing up during off hours to help clean up the back parking area. Logan had begun attending staff meetings unprompted. Harper was well known among the kitchen staff, respected even. They didn't just work here. They had found something of themselves in this place. Something rooted. Something honest. We ordered simply. Nothing too extravagant. No grand gestures. Reese asked for the house steak. Logan went with grilled salmon. Harper, naturally, ordered the mushroom risotto she used to pretend she hated as a teenager. I chose the coco vin, an old favorite. When the food arrived, I noticed no one touched their phones. No one documented anything. No photos. No performance. Just conversation. We talked. Not about money. Not about Wallace or Clarice or the mess that had once wrapped itself around all our names like weeds. We talked about work. About how Harper was considering culinary school. Not for prestige, but because she genuinely wanted to learn. Logan said he was thinking of branching out, maybe starting his own car service. This time, though, he wasn't asking for a loan. Just telling me his thoughts, as a man does when he wants to be understood rather than rescued. Reese talked about a community garden he'd been volunteering at on weekends. Said it helped him think. I asked what he thought about. He shrugged. Mistakes, he said. And what comes after? We ate slow. We didn't rush through anything. Time had become something we were learning to share again. It felt foreign at first, but not unpleasant. Like trying on a jacket you thought you'd outgrown, only to realize it fits better now than it ever did before. Near the end of the meal, the waiter came by and asked the question that once would have sent everyone's eyes toward me, and will this be one check or separate? Harper leaned forward before I could open my mouth. Not him, she said firmly. This one's on us. I looked at her, at Logan, at Reese. Their faces were steady. There was no smugness, no point to be proven. Just three grown people finally understanding the weight of a shared meal. I leaned back slowly, set my napkin down on my lap, and exhaled. That's the first real meal I've ever had with my children, I said softly. Harper blinked. What do you mean? I smiled, not bitter, just honest. Every other dinner. Birthdays, graduations, Sunday nights. I was the one trying to hold it all together. Carrying the check. Carrying the silence. Carrying the effort. This feels different. Logan looked down, his jaw tightening. Reese swirled the last of his drink. I didn't say that to make anyone feel bad. I added, I said it because it means something to me that you finally see it. Not the bill, the table, what it means to have one, and who gets to sit at it. Harper nodded, eyes damp. You were always at the table, Dad. We were the ones who walked away. No, I said. You were taught to walk away. You learned it from watching what the world rewards: flash, noise, convenience. But what matters most? That's built slow. And it's quiet. You had to go through life to understand that. We sat there for a moment, letting the weight of that truth settle without crushing us. Then Logan raised his glass. To second chances, he said. I raised mine. To earned ones, I replied. We clinked glasses, and I felt something inside me shift again. Not a breaking, not a cracking, but a realignment. The same old bones in a new formation. I didn't need their apologies anymore. I didn't even need their gratitude. What I had, finally, was presence. Not just theirs, but mine. Fully. Steady. Seen. As we left the restaurant, I walked a few paces behind them, watching them laugh about something Reese said. It wasn't the laugh of people putting on a show. It was genuine. Unforced. The kind of sound families make when they're no longer trying to be one. They just are. I looked back once toward the table. Still lit. Still clean. The chair pulled out slightly, waiting to be used again someday. And I realized, with quiet certainty, the table was always mine. They just hadn't seen the man sitting at it. Until now.